Winter is well and truly here, with temperatures reaching well below freezing in Ukraine. Troops fighting on the ground are faced with even more obstacles, while civilians face a crisis with restricted heating and power. I spoke to military ethics expert Dr. Marina Miron from King's College London about the challenges facing both sides this winter.
On the one hand, Russia is targeting the energy supply. And I mean, more broadly, let's say Russia has been playing the energy card in Europe as well. Now it's targeting Ukrainian energy infrastructure to break the will of people. So we can compare it a little bit to the Second World War bombing of Dresden by Allied forces, where the idea was to force the population to exert pressure upon the political leadership to capitulate. And from this perspective, that is one reason why Russia is doing it, knowing that resupplying Ukraine with the necessary parts is virtually impossible because Ukrainian energy infrastructure is outdated. So Europeans just don't have those transformators which would be fitting, first of all, and the generators that are coming to Ukraine, they are fuel powered. And fuel is another commodity which is in shortage, so that makes the situation very difficult. So essentially, it makes it very difficult for the Europeans to help Ukraine, and it makes it obviously taxing on the Ukrainian people who have been seeing this war going on for so long with all this help coming from the West, and still the war is still going and Russians are still there and they're still fighting. And you know, when it gets cold, when they don't have heating at minus 20 degrees, when they don't have water, I mean communications obviously as well, it will become very difficult, where people will just think about survival and say, we really don't care who is leading the country, we just want this nightmare to stop. And that's what Russia is counting on. That's kind of the one thing. And the other thing, obviously, it will affect military operations, because if Kiev is without power, they cannot send basic intelligence to the troops on the ground. And the troops on the ground also need to be supplied. They need warm clothing that, you know, they've been receiving from Canada, for instance. They need also heating. The hospitals have to operate in order to deal with casualties and so on and so forth. So it will become much more difficult logistically to supply the troops, also because the Russians have been targeting the railway network. And so it will hamper the military operation from many perspectives, not just from the supply perspective, but also from kind of informational perspective, where the troops will not have the intelligence, they will not know where the Russians are, and it will make it difficult. Hardware repair, another issue, you know, they would have to somehow get the hardware from the theater of operations to get it repaired somewhere outside Ukraine, because Ukraine doesn't have the capacity to repair the hardware. So that will become another problem. It will take much longer to get it out and back into the theater. So those are the two components. One is exerting pressure upon the population, basically to rebel against the government, and the second one is making it difficult to sustain the troops on the battlefield. For Russia, obviously, it is not going to be easy, but we're seeing that there are some volunteers in Russia who are gathering money to supply troops with winter uniforms, because they should have switched to winter uniforms, not now, not when the winter is coming, but ideally around 1st of October to mid-October. That's when armed forces switch to winter uniforms at temperatures, when the temperatures reach about 10 degrees Celsius. And so there is also a shortage of that, and we have seen reports that the mobilized troops are also undersourced. So Russia is facing those problems as well. However, not as severely as Ukraine, because, you know, they still can, they still have the supply routes. The question is getting the stuff to the troops in the field, but it will definitely affect the morale. Especially, I'm expecting the newly mobilized people being sent to the front lines in this cold without any battle experience, without any knowledge of what is expecting them. That will be devastating. However, I do assume that the Russians know that it's going to be difficult for them, so they want to make it even more difficult for the Ukrainians, in order than to say, look at the adversary, they're in a much worse position, so you have nothing to complain about. I think for Putin, he will not be paying much attention to those reports. He will be getting debriefed by his spy chief and by General Surovikin, who is on the ground. And I think that the pressure on Putin is generally coming from another direction, namely from the elite surrounding Putin, in terms of his approach to the special military operation. The first one being kind of this colossal miscalculation at the very beginning of the so-called special military operation, where Putin probably expected Kiev to capitulate within the first 3 weeks, and then the adjustment of the overall strategy, where they were seeing this resistance from the Ukrainian forces, the support from Western countries, which they didn't expect. And so there are many hardliners within file and rank who are saying we need a much more violent approach. We cannot be just moving slowly, taking one village after another. And the setbacks on the battlefield have created a lot of pressure, as a result of which General Surovikin was appointed as a theater commander. There was no such position before that. There were 4 different commanders, and they apparently didn't communicate amongst each other, and if they needed some sort of a decision being approved, they had to go all the way to the MOD. The MOD would then go back and say, yes, you can do that or you cannot do that. So the chain of command going through these higher echelons of military hierarchy, that took a lot of time. And so the pressure upon Putin was to take a more hardline approach, hence the appointment of Surovikin, and as kind of the symbolic thing, when Surovikin started his job, on the first day the airstrike started, and that's basically if Putin is to get soft, then he will basically be facing more pressure and competition from the likes of Yevgeny Prigozhin, who is the head of Wagner. And so apparently there is a kind of this political game going on alongside the war in Ukraine, as I said, with Prigozhin gaining a lot of political influence, showing that his Wagner troops are indispensable in Ukraine. So I think for Putin it's difficult, because he's facing that kind of internal pressure in terms of how to go about the special military operation, rather than about the fact that, some of his Russian citizens refuse to serve.
Both sides must endure this harsh winter in what could shape up to be a decisive period in this war. Simon Banks, The Sun.